Got it. Just making sure I understand the buttons to push here. Sarah, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be, I guess I could say, back home. Like Sarah said, I've been in Missouri for the last 3 years, but California native, California farm kid. Originally grew up just in Galt, so just south of where we are today. So yeah, I do wish it was a brighter topic. But at least I don't have to talk about tree nut markets, right? Which some days I do. So some of you have heard me speak before, and I often talk about the macroeconomic shifts, right? The positive economic development in emerging markets, developing countries, and the powerful positive force that is for food demand. Right? Especially the high-value products like California is known for producing, right? So been talking about that for years. There's a flip side to that coin, unfortunately. And those same positive economic forces as countries develop around the world that are great for food demand also can put tremendous pressure on what is already a challenging farm labor situation. So we're going to look at the other side of that coin today. All right, I'd like to start out with kind of the basics here. How is all this manifesting itself, right? Easy thing to dismiss is that federal minimum wage that you see there in yellow at a very low level, right? The federal government's really been letting states kind of handle minimum wage increases for many, many years. That top line you see there is the average California agricultural wage that you see there above $20 an hour on average. Look at that compounded annual growth rate of over 6% over the last decade. I mean, that's kind of mind-boggling when you think of a 6% annual growth rate in that ag wage rate in California. Put it in the context of the Federal Reserve right now trying to get overall inflation back down to around 2%. Right? We're not there yet. But just think about that for a second. It's a bit mind-boggling. We've seen rapid increases in California minimum wage, which you see there in green, and we've seen rapid increases in the average ag wage rate at the U.S. level as well. That's what you see in orange there. When I look at these data, to me it tells a positive human story about agriculture, right? That's what I see as I go, look, I recognize that farm work, and I know firsthand, is tough. And the industry's doing what it can, right? Keeping economics in check, doing what it can to treat people fairly, and I think these data reflect that, right? Now, that's what I see when I look at this. And you'll notice I'm saying, hey, this is a positive social equity story that we don't tell enough, but I'm going to qualify that and say, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. The reason I say that is you might have someone else look at these same exact data and come away with a completely different conclusion. Somebody else could look at this data and go, when I look at minimum wage and I look at the agricultural wage, there's too big a gap there. Minimum wage needs to go up. Right? Someone could interpret it like that. Right? Now, we could stay here for 3 more hours and debate the merits of whether I'm right or the second argument's right and what the ramifications are. Right? The short version is you start to raise minimum wage even higher, guess what? Ag wage is going to go up too. Has to maintain a certain kind of gap to be able to attract labor as minimum wage goes up. And those kinds of impacts are always inflationary in general. And guess what? Whenever we have inflationary impacts, the people that get hurt the hardest are those lower income consumers. Right? That's the short version of what we could talk about for 3 hours. So this is the backdrop. Now, these are the data that Sarah was mentioning that she really wanted me to highlight today. I'm going to take you through relatively quickly through a group of slides for different parts of the world. What you're looking at here is the decade over decade change in population by age group. Right? Now, we could argue that probably the most important group to us is probably that dark blue, the 20 to 49 kind of age group. That's kind of the prime ag, farm labor kind of wage, agriculture labor kind of age. Not to offend any of the mid-50 folks out there like me, right? I'm great behind a computer, probably past my prime in terms of dragging hay bales around. So let's look at this. So again, these are changes, not total global population. This is the entire world, and what you see here is that in previous decades, we added a lot of young people, under 20, 20 to 49, et cetera, and that trend has significantly slowed down, right? The driver of that are birth rates declining. And that is one of the consequences of economic development in countries around the world. As countries get more economically developed, their birth rates decline. Right? So that is a direct result of this. So that's the world. And then we're going to look at some different regions. So let's look at the U.S. And I'm saying, look, in the U.S., one thing you see is that in this decade between 2020 and 2030, right, so this here would be the change since 2020, we're still adding a lot of relatively young folks to that 20 to 49 age group. But to my point here, that doesn't really matter. In the U.S., that's a moot point because as we know, folks in the U.S., U.S.-born population doesn't tend to be interested in farm labor or even ag processing type of labor, right? So that's our biggest challenge in the U.S. Folks don't have to do farm labor to survive in this country. All right, so let's look at Mexico. Still by far our biggest source of agricultural labor. This is not a positive story. Again, remember, I want to see dark blue. Well, that dark blue goes down, down, and between 2040 and 2050, the United Nations is actually expecting to start to see a decline in those younger folks in Mexico. Right? So that's a disturbing trend in terms of the overall labor pool available from a country like Mexico. Right? Mexican birth rates right now sit somewhere between 2.5 children per woman, and the U.S. is somewhere between 1.5 to 2. So their birth rates have significantly come down over the last 40, 50 years. They're almost the same as ours. That's a challenge from a labor pool perspective. Okay? South Africa. If you look at the H2A data, South Africa is second to Mexico in terms of U.S. ag labor force through the H2A program. So South Africa is becoming more and more important to us in U.S. agriculture. This is a little more of a positive story. Look, even out through 2050, you still see some additions to that 20 to 49 age group. So not as bad as the Mexican story that I just told. There's a little bit of a longer runway. So when you look at this data, you go, okay, it sort of makes sense that we would start relying more and more on South Africa, right? Tends to be a country where even a lot of the rural folks in South Africa actually speak English. That helps, right? And relatively better story here. Let's go to the Caribbean, which would kind of be our next important area, particularly Jamaica, where we attract labor. This is not going to help us, right? You've got small numbers of folks overall, right? Relatively small populations, and you see that same kind of decline, similar to what you saw in Mexico. Between 2040 and 2050, they actually lose a big portion of that population. I want to remind everybody, because this is decade over decade change, This right here represents that change since 2040. So we need to keep that in mind, right? Our runway to figure some of this stuff out isn't quite as long as we think, right? It's not going to start being a problem in 2050, right? It's already a challenge, but when you look at these data and you compare these charts, you go, wow, starting in somewhere in 2040-ish, there could be a big pull down in available labor. Okay? Let's go to Central. I'm focusing on areas of the world where we tend to rely on agricultural labor. Boom. Central America is a little better. At least they're still adding through 2040. But again, ultimately, they end up in the same place. And then South America, this may be probably, if you just look at these data, maybe the most pessimistic story in terms of age groups here, right? A rapid decline and a major pullback where they're actually losing folks in those age categories. So very, very similar story. I wanted to show you one contrasting set of data, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. You may have heard this before. That's the one place in the world where the population is not, on average, getting older. They still have very high birth rates, and so you see a completely different kind of a trend going on in sub-Saharan Africa, where they continue to add a lot of young folks. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting that there is no way that we can continue to attract the labor we need in U.S. agriculture. Right? What I am suggesting here is that that pool, that pie, is going to get smaller. That doesn't mean we can't get a bigger slice of the pie, but as we're already experiencing, we know that's a challenge, right? Unless there is some hardcore creativity in our immigration policies and they're tied to agriculture somehow. All right. Have to talk about income. That also creates a challenge. There's a lot going on here, admittedly, on this slide, but this shows the real GDP per capita, which we tend to use as a barometer of individual income, right? So it's in real terms. And look at the expectations out through 2032. The highest change in GDP per capita is coming from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, the yellow and green. Now, I've left Asia off here because, again, I'm focusing on where we tend to get labor, this side of the world, for the most part, right? China would outperform all these if I had it up here, but I don't. But, again, the story here is, look, I know it's all relative. Incomes are a lot more favorable in the U.S. This is in growth rate, right? Percentage change. I recognize that, but the point is there is continuing greater economic opportunities for a lot of these folks back home in their home countries. Right? That's the point. Now, that doesn't mean folks don't want to come to the U.S. if there's some kind of a path to being able to stay here long term, right? But yeah, incomes are going up. Economies are developing. There are more opportunities than ever before in these other countries around the world. And I'll leave you with, this is my last slide. There's a lot of talk, there has been for the last 2.5 years, about near-shoring, friend-shoring, home-shoring, right? Let's bring back more things to the U.S. Let's near-shore, bring back more investment into Mexico, where we have a friendly trade relationship, less reliance on other players in the world, right? I think there are a lot of positives to that, which probably you're very familiar with, right? It's really making supply chains closer to home that are more resilient, less potential to be disrupted by geopolitics, those types of things. There's a downside to that, though, as well. Most of the foreign direct investment in Mexico, which you see here, most of that foreign direct investment goes into some type of manufacturing, right? So as more and more manufacturing is developed in Mexico, again, that creates more opportunities for folks in Mexico to stay put, get a job that's maybe a little easier to do, and still make a wage. So these opportunities continue to expand as well. So my take-homes before I turn it over to Ali, take-homes would be the demographic changes going on around the world are not favorable for U.S. agricultural labor, right? But again, I reiterate, what I'm showing you here is that overall pool or pie will continue to get smaller. Is there a way for us maybe to get a bigger slice of a smaller pie? Probably, right? And we don't have time for me to talk about that right now, but maybe we can get into some of that in a second. So I thank you for your time, and I wish I had more positive news, but I'm pragmatic, and it is what it is. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Roland. That was a good lead-in because we did a bad job of coordinating, so that was lucky. But I'm really excited to be here with you all today. It's actually my first time at an Agri-Pulse Summit, and I'm honestly flattered to have the opportunity to speak to you all. I'm Allie Hill. I'm an assistant professor in agricultural economics at UC Berkeley. And yes, UC Berkeley still works in agriculture, and maybe we'll remember that after today, but we source all of our PhD students from Davis. We'll remember that. Don't tell them I said that. They'll be mad at me. Okay. So I'm here talking to you today because basically all of my research centers on the U.S. agricultural workforce, and the bulk of it really on California crop workers. And so I'm going to be talking to you. We're going to kind of hone in on California from that really nice overview of what's happening globally. I'm going to be showing you some trends in the California workforce in terms of, we'll talk very briefly about demographics because I think Roland covered that quite well, but also a lot about costs, and we'll re-show that kind of rising wage chart. And we'll look at trends over the last 20 years in California. We'll draw some comparisons between what's happening in California and our western neighbors of Washington and Oregon. And we'll contrast that with what's happening with some of the southern ag states of Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And then I will try to give a little more positive outlook and hopefully use that to spur into a conversation between us all at the end, because like Roland, I hate giving these talks that are just sad news. And when I look out in the audience, I feel it. So if you haven't had enough coffee and you need to go back to bed after this, you can after this slide. These are my main take-home messages and I'm just gonna kind of drill them in today. So the first one is really farm employees in the Western US and California in particular have been harder and harder to find. And per Roland's point and per what I'll show you, I think that trend is going to continue. The second point, which we'll spend more time on, is that farm employees have become more and more expensive to employ. And I will show you there's basically, without a doubt, that trend will continue. But I don't want to leave you with that. So what I'll come back to at the end but I want us to have a dialogue about, so what do we do? Where do we go forward? So I liked Sarah's initial slide. Technology is going to be one thing we'll probably talk a lot about as a solution. But there's also some interim ones, right? So employers here are already really heavily using the H-2A visa program. I think that'll continue for a while. But the H-2A program adds some complexity, right? So there's a lot of legal things that you then need to handle. I think that's contributed a lot to California in particular's heavy use of farm labor contractors, employers having to have their own HR departments. All of these things come with extra costs. There's also, H-2A workers, part of why that's the extra costs associated with them are manageable right now is that they're, from all the data we have, more productive. They tend to be higher educated, so for right now, it's affordable. But in the future, we're gonna have to mechanize, invest in AI, and then actually I wanna wrap up with a conversation about reducing other costs and potentially increasing, let's not reduce, revenues. Okay, so let's go into that first point, talking about trends. Why are farm employees harder to find in California? So here I'm showing you a comparison of worker responses. These are non-H-2A workers on crop operations in California, comparing their responses in 2000 to the most recent data in 2022. And there's 2 points I want to make. Roland already made the second one quite well, but the first is that workers are more settled than they used to be. So historically, a lot of crop production in general has relied on workers essentially as showing up at a farm when and where they're needed. So this is one of the most striking demographic shifts in the US agricultural population, and it's even more striking in California. So 20 years ago, half of our workforce engaged in follow the crop migration. Today, less than 20% does. So it's not just that the labor pool is shrinking, it's that we have a change in how workers are willing to travel for work. So why is that? Workers are more settled. They've been living in the US for longer, more have US born kids. They don't necessarily want to be traveling around for seeking employment. So that's point number one. The second, I won't spend very much time on because Roland made it. We have fewer new immigrant workers. So how this is showing up in California data, today our average crop worker is 40 years old. 20 years ago, they were 10 years younger. We're seeing a slight decrease in the proportion that are foreign-born, still quite high. Workers have a much higher average farm experience. But one thing I want to point out from these data, and actually it's supported by Bureau of Labor Statistics job-to-job flows, is that when you ask workers how long they want to work in agriculture who are currently working in the industry, the vast majority across time have reported wanting to stay in ag as long as they're possible. They like working outdoors. They like working with their friends. They like the job. So today, 80% of these workers say they want to continue working in ag as long as possible. So that's not the problem. The problem is getting new people into ag. And so here, I'm an economist, right? Like as a PhD student, what do you say when people talk about worker shortages? You're like, well, give them more money. That's the problem, right? So Roland already showed this chart, but now let's talk about labor costs. So this is the trend in hourly wage rates reported by the USDA Farm Labor Survey in California, and then they grouped together some other states. So California is that top blue line where we're seeing the largest growth in wage rates across time. I'm stopping it here in 2022. We're upwards of $20 an hour. It's followed pretty closely by Washington and Oregon, and then in all of these, I'll contrast what's happening in California, Washington, and Oregon with some gray lines for Florida, Texas, and Arizona. And so those are generally going to be below those other states in terms of what's happening with worker costs. So unfortunately, that's not a solution. We'll come back to solutions at the end. But now I want to get a little bit more into, so this is, talking about an hourly wage rate can be a good thing for workers. It can be challenging for employers who face constraints on how much they can actually pay. So now I want to get a little bit more into what's happening for these employers. So let's look at total payroll costs in California. So this is using census of ag data over the last 20 years. And this is showing a breakdown. So this is total California farm labor expenditures, and it's divided between direct hire expenditures in that orange and contract labor expenditures in the blue. So California actually has had some of the largest growth in contract labor expenditures of any other state, but in general, over this 20-year period, California farm payrolls have more than doubled. So they're 2.5 times higher in 2022 than they were in 2002. And those payroll costs have increased more in California than any other state in the US. It is fairly closely followed by Washington and Oregon, which also more than doubled, and Texas, also more than doubled. But we look at Florida and Arizona, and those are less than double increases in payroll. One other thing I want to point out is often when I see sensitive ag data on labor, they actually don't look at total labor costs. They look at labor share, the labor share percentage of total operating costs. And I think that really masks the story that I was just telling you. Because if we look at that, so if we compare that last slide with this one, what I want to point out is it's not just labor. All costs are going up. Because actually in California, the labor share of operating expenses in 2002 and 2022 is almost identical, 29% to 30%. That's not the case in all states. In Washington, actually, the payroll percentage increased. And then we have Florida, and most strikingly in Arizona, the labor share percentage of total operating expenses decreased. But I just want to point that out, that all costs are going up. It's not just labor. So here, I'm going to give you a bunch of reasons why I think this trend is going to continue. I don't think I really need to convince you of this, but I do just want to touch on these things because I think they're important. So will rising labor costs continue? Yes. Reason number one, state minimum wages are rising. So here I'm highlighting that in those kind of 6 comparison states. California and Washington have been kind of the leaders in these rising, increasing minimum wages. There's no world in which minimum wages are going to decrease. Will they continue increasing? I would guess yes. So we have a proposed legislation right now for an $18 minimum wage in 2026. So that's going to continue to contribute to rising labor costs. We also have H2A. So we have the H2A adverse effect wage rate is rising. And also, because we're having a smaller pool of domestic workers, our use of the H2A program is increasing. So these are usually when you see the adverse effect wage rates, you see it in those map forms, but I actually think that really hides how much that the adverse effect wage rate has increased across time, and increased a lot. Here we have in California, and then Washington and Oregon have the same one, and relative to Florida, Texas, and Arizona, much higher adverse effect wage rates. So that's the minimum wage for the H2A workers. And actually, Florida has for a while been the biggest user of the H2A program, but something I want to highlight here is if we see that blue line, which is California, is really getting close. So I'm stopping these data in 2022. It did not surpass in 2023, but we'll continue watching this to see when California surpasses Florida in terms of H2A use. And that's going to, again, continue to contribute to rising labor costs. Here I'll just mention a few other things. So there's a lot of other policies at play here that are going to contribute. You might be familiar with me from some of my work on AB 1066 on California's overtime legislation for ag workers, which is costly and impactful for employers, but I also find costs workers money too. There's union laws will potentially contribute to higher labor costs. And in general, I think I just want to make the point that you guys have the distinct pleasure of working in one of the most regulated industries in the US, and it's such a complicated employment environment. And so handling that is just going to increase overhead costs for figuring out how to constantly comply in this ever-evolving legal structure. I think it's increased reliance on farm labor contractors from my conversations with people, and they have overhead premiums I've heard estimates from 20 to 40%. So the last point is that these worker shortages, so having too few workers is also going to create this cycle where we're going to keep raising wages to try to get the workers that we need. And we also have to compete with other industries, right? So we have to compete with the $20 an hour minimum wage in the fast food industry now. So this is all going to continue to push. We already see that the average farm wage is well above the minimum, but it's going to continue to push that average farm wage higher and higher. A slightly more positive perspective, and this is where I'll try to leave us today, is that we've been talking about costs, but sales are also up. So this map is breaking down total farm commodity sales in billions of dollars in the same sense of ag data over the last 20 years. So we've seen the largest growth in California in fruit and tree nut production, cattle, and vegetables and melon. So farm sales are also up. So they're up in all states. Actually, the largest increase was for Washington. But what's important here is let's contrast what's happening in sales with what happened in total payroll costs. And here emerged some kind of winners and losers in terms of expenditures versus revenues, right? So California, our increase in total payroll costs is larger than our increase in sales. So I've highlighted it in red. The same is true in Oregon. On the other hand, that's not the case in Washington, Florida, Texas, and Arizona. And Arizona really emerges as kind of a victor throughout this narrative, looking at costs versus revenues. So I put some maps up here, and actually if you're interested in exploring any of these data or have suggestions or other things you'd be interested in, I encourage you to explore my website. So I just want to kind of end us there. So employees are going to continue to be harder to find. They're going to continue to be more expensive to employ. And West Coast employers are going to have to figure out to adapt to continue to have a thriving agricultural industry, not just in California, but in the US. So I have some options here, but actually what was interesting to me in that slide that Sarah put up is that one person put facilitating consumer interest as a strategy for an opportunity for continuing the industry growth. I actually want to say that one of my biggest frustrations in my work on overtime laws was hearing from audience people something like, oh, employers don't want to pay workers time and a half. It's just like, you talk to any employer and they will tell you their greatest assets are their workers. You would love to pay them time and a half. Does the retailer that you're selling to give you enough money to be able to afford doing that? And so I really think that there's a system change that needs to happen here, and I think it involves retailers. I think it involves figuring out how to increase revenues by working with these organizations. And I will end us there.
Thank you, Allie and Roland. And I hate to say that we're at the end of our time here, but I'm going to ask one quick question of each of you before I let you go. And then can you stay with us today so people can ask more questions offline? I really appreciate that. Roland, given the demographic changes that you pointed out, and also looking at overall U.S. farm economic trends, we're looking at more of a downturn than an upturn in revenues. Does that support continued mechanization, given everything that you're seeing, that we have to go to the automation and a technological solution?
This thing working? Oh, there we go. So I think when you talk about the general farming economic downturn, I guess I would remind everyone that is largely driven by commodity crops from the middle of the country, right? That's the biggest contributor to this downturn in farm revenue and net cash farm income that we expect in general to continue over the next few years, right? So a lot of that's driven by corn and soybeans, which are already highly mechanized industries, a lot of precision ag, et cetera. So I would want to draw that contrast. To Allie's slide, though, where you focus a little more on the higher value crops, she had a slide that showed those increasing sales. Sarah, look, I don't think, given the labor situation, that we have much of a choice but to continue to look at opportunities for capital investment, right, in technology, labor-saving technology, making the labor we do have more efficient. Given the rising wage rates, right? It depends on the individual operation, depends on the technology, but at some point, those two things kind of cross, and all of a sudden, it makes more sense to just spend more CapEx on tech and not have to rely so much on labor, and in some situations, we're there.
Thank you. And Allie, just quick for you, your research on the overtime law clearly indicated that a lot of people ended up with less wages being paid than more. You suggested today that maybe we need to look more on the revenue side of things. Have you thought more about how policymakers should think about how you have a win-win so that employers not only can afford to have these wage increases and employees can continue to have as much work as they want?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've talked about, two other states now have implemented an overtime tax credit, so they will actually compensate employers when they pay overtime rates to workers. I think that's probably the biggest win. I think we also have a massive deficit, and so that's quite unlikely to happen in California right now. But I think in general, I think it really speaks to having better analyses of these policies before they go into place, because the other piece of it is that a lot of employers have already adapted to this overtime law, and it's unlikely that they're gonna it's unlikely that reversing it, which is another potential option, would really bring us back to where we were before, both in terms of worker income and employer costs. But I think that, yeah, there's a lot of avenues going forward where if we do more careful analyses in advance, that it can really create more effective policies that are more cost efficient and protective for both workers and employers in the California industry.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists. It's been a great discussion.